and welcome to this project walkthrough. In this walkthrough, we're going to be analyzing data from FIFA using Microsoft Power BI. And if you're unfamiliar with FIFA, it is the most popular football or soccer game in the world. And the data set we have is from 2015 through 2022, and it has data on player ratings, which club they played for, and a lot more around their nationality and other statistics that we might be able to use. And if you're unfamiliar with Microsoft Power BI, it's one of the most popular BI tools in the world. So people use it for everything from loading data, cleaning it, analyzing it, to building reports and sharing those reports. Power BI is more powerful than Excel, so you can do more powerful analysis and share that analysis. And it's easier to use than Python and R in a lot of cases, so it can save you some coding. So we'll look through some of the main features of Power BI today as we analyze our FIFA data. I'll also talk a little bit about when you might want to use Power BI and when you might want to use a different tool. So without any other chatter, let's go ahead and get started. So the first thing you see when you open up Power BI is this window asking you where you want to import data from. Now, if you use Windows, Power BI is a free application you can install, which is really nice. So you can go ahead and use it that way. Otherwise, if you don't use Windows, you can try to create a virtual machine or install Windows in a different way. We're also launching Power BI courses at DataQuest, and these courses will have the Power BI interface in your browser, the full desktop interface. So if you want to learn and use Power BI, using our DataQuest courses is a great way to get your feet wet as well. All right, so on this import screen, the first thing we'll do is we'll go ahead and import data from Excel. And our FIFA data from 2015 through 2022 is in this Excel workbook. Now, the link to this workbook is available in the video description. So let me go ahead and open this up, and then Power BI will start to import it. Now, you may choose to work with a lot of data from previous years, but for now, I'm only going to pick data from 2021 and 2022. And I'm going to go ahead and load the data. You could hit transform data if you want to transform and clean the data before you load it in. But in this case, we're going to do some transformation afterwards. So we can just go ahead and load it straight in. And once we hit load, Power BI will go ahead and start reading the data sets in to the Power BI interface. Depending on your computer, this can be really fast or it can take a little while. So we're now in the report view in Power BI. The three main views are here: report, data, and model. So before we do anything, let's go ahead and look at the data view. If you've used Excel or any spreadsheet, this is going to look familiar to you. But this will let us just take a quick look at our data and just look at the shape and other things. So at the bottom, we can see that we have 18,944 rows. Each row is a particular player, and it has their statistics for a given season. And you can see on the right, we have two data sets. We have the 2021 data set, and we have the 2022 data set. I'm going to jump over to the 2022 data set because that's the one we're going to use more. So let's go ahead and just look at some of the columns here. So some of the important columns here, you can see there's a short name for each player. There's also a long name. There is a list of the positions each player plays, as well as their overall rating. So this is their rating in FIFA, how good of a player they are in FIFA, and their potential. So potential rating is, in a few seasons, how good could this player be eventually? There's also the value and wage, so that's their salary. There's age. There's a lot of other biographical information. There's also information on which club they currently play for, which league that club is in, and a lot of other columns too. I'm not going to go through every single one right now, but you can get a sense of some of these columns. They just show different statistics for the player. And at the very end, there's a few URL columns, which actually can be used to show images of the player face, their club logo, their national flag, etc. All right, so hopefully that gives you a good view of the data. And generally, this data view is a really good place to just explore the data, look at different columns, check out any interesting relationships you can see, etc. So we will come back to this view to do a few things later. But for now, let's go ahead to the report view. And let's actually do some exploratory data analysis. So we're just going to build a couple of visualizations just to get a sense of the data and what it looks like. So first, when you want to build a visualization, this visualization tab at the right shows you the different types of visualizations that are available. And this fields tab shows you the data sets that you can work with. And if you open these up, you can see the exact columns that you can use for visualization. So to start with, we're going to make a bar chart. And what we're going to do is we're going to look at player age. So of people who are currently active players, what is their age? So we're going to drag age to the x-axis, and then we're also going to drag it to the y-axis. And what we'll say here is count. So we will go ahead and count how many players are at each age. So you can see in our data set, about 1,547 players are 21 years old, and that is the most common age among the players in FIFA in 2022. And you can see that tails off. There are not a lot of players older than 40 or so. There's 14 players who are 40, and that kind of tails off. So you can see overwhelmingly players tend to be active football players in their early 20s from this FIFA data, and that tails off pretty quickly. And in Power BI, one really nice thing about charts is you can resize them and create space for other charts. So in this case, I'm going to add a second chart here. And what we'll do is we'll just look at overall rating against age. So we'll go ahead and we'll drag age to the x-axis here. And we'll go ahead and find our overall rating column, which is here, and we'll drag that to our values. So this little drop down here lets you choose how you want to summarize that value. So in this case, we want to look at the average rating by age. So this tells us how does a player's rating in FIFA change over time. So you would expect players who are younger to have higher ratings because typically younger players are more athletic. But it's not always true that the youngest players are the best because more experienced players also tend to be better. So what we're looking at is that age where athleticism and experience both combine to create players who are the best overall. And that looks like it goes from the mid-20s, 25 or so, through to the late 30s. So you can see kind of where overall ratings tend to peak for players. All right, and this is pretty amazing. This is a really nice thing about Power BI. We have done very little in terms of dragging and dropping some fields, and we've been able to create two very nice charts that describe our data set. So that's the power of Power BI, is you can really quickly and easily create these powerful visualizations and share them. So you can see this little publish tab right here. I'm not going to use it right now, but you can actually share and publish all of your reports online. So I'm going to go ahead and rename this page. We'll just call this Exploratory Analysis. All right. And next, we'll create a new page. And I'm going to call this page Top Players. Because what we'll do here is we'll just create a table, which is another type of visualization, that just shows us the top players around the world in our FIFA data. So you can see there's a lot of different types of visualizations we could create. The one we're going to pick is called a table. So I'll just click on this. It'll pop into the interface. And now we can pick the values we want. So the values we're going to pick are, we're going to pick the player name, which in this case is we're going to look at short name. So we'll drag this into values. And then we're going to look at overall, so players' overall rating. We're also going to look at their national flag. So we'll take the national flag URL. And a cool thing we can do is we can also look at their face. So we'll take the player face URL. All right. So these right now just show us URLs, but we can change the data type to actually make them show images. So to do that, let's go back to our data here, and then we'll scroll all the way to the right to find the columns we want, which are this nation flag URL and player face URL. Then let's click on them. And what you can do in Power BI is you can change the data category. So in this case, we'll change it to image URL. So we'll do that for player face URL and for nation flag URL. And what this does is it tells Power BI, hey, this isn't just a regular text column. This column actually has image URLs. So what you can do is download the image and display it. So you can see in our table, we now have pictures of the players and the flags of the countries they play for. So we only want the top players in this table. So let's go ahead and just sort by overall. And then what we can do is we can actually do a slice. So we can filter this data. And the way we'll do that is we'll drag our overall column over here. And what we can see is this filters section. And what this enables us to do is filter the values in each column. So what we'll do here is we'll say only show items when the overall rating, items in this case would be rows or players, when the overall rating is greater than 85. So let's go ahead and apply that. And you can see we've cut down our number of players significantly. We only have a few players here. And these are the top players in the world. Players with names you may recognize, even if you're not a football fan. Names like Lionel Messi, Cristiano Ronaldo. So that is our top players table. Next, what we can do is we can look at some summary statistics. So let me go ahead and create another report page, and I'll go ahead and rename this to summary stats. And what we can look at now are summary stats like total players in each club, total number of clubs in each league, how the average of player ratings by club, etc. And the way we can do that is using this matrix visualization. So I'll add in a matrix visualization. And what a matrix visualization does is it lets you add rows, and then it aggregates all of the column values by those rows. So in this case, what I'll do is I'll go ahead and add a league. So we'll add league name as a row. And then what we can do is we can add a league name again as a column. And what we'll do here is we'll look at, as a value, not a column. And what we'll go ahead here is just look at count. So this tells you the number of players in each league. We can also look at the average rating by league by dragging overall in over here and selecting the average. So this is the average player rating by league. So actually, let's just rename this to make it easier. Player rating. Let's call it average AVG player rating. All right, and let's call this players in league. Okay, so let's sort this by average player rating, and we can see Spain Primera División has the highest average player rating, then this Italian league, then the English Premier League. And if we look at number of players in each league, we can see that Major League Soccer in the US has the most players, followed by the Argentine Primera División. All right, so there's a couple other summary statistics we can do here. We can look at this by club, which could be interesting, right? We can see which football clubs have the highest overall rating average among their players. So what we'll do here is we'll pull out club name into our row, and then we'll look at the same columns as before. So we'll look at overall values, not columns. I keep mixing my terminology up there. So we'll look at that, and then we will just, again, drag in club name and look at the count, which will just give us how many players are in each club. And let's go ahead and rename these. So we'll rename this player rating, average player rating, AVG. All right, and then let's call this players in club. All right, so we can then sort this to see which club has the highest average player rating, and that's Juventus and Paris Saint-Germain. Hope I pronounced that right. I do not know French or Italian. All right, and then we can see how many players are in each club as well. So we can see which clubs have the most players. A blank here indicates that the player is not signed to a club. So there are 61 players in FIFA who are not signed to a club currently, and that's their average rating. But the next highest is Arsenal with 33, and tied with a lot of other clubs. Let's go back to our average player rating. So those are a couple of charts that we can make using this matrix visualization. And if you're familiar with pivot tables, this is really similar to what a pivot table is doing. It's basically taking a value, taking a unique value from the data, and then it's computing summary statistics for that unique value. So for USA Major League Soccer, we've taken how many players are in that league as well as the average rating, which was just computed by creating a pivot table and summarizing all of the rows that are associated with Major League Soccer. If you're familiar with Python, it's similar to a pandas group by as well, or R, also similar to a group by there. So next we can take a look at some of the more advanced features of Power BI. And the first thing we can look at is changes. So we can look at how player ratings changed and how salaries changed from the 2021 through the 2022 season. And to do that, we're actually going to need to merge our two data sets. So let's go back to this data explorer. So we have FIFA 21 and we have FIFA 22. And what we want to do is we want to merge by player name these two data sets. So we want to associate a player record in the FIFA 22 dataset with the same player record in the FIFA 21 dataset. Then what we can do is we can compare their overall rating from 2021 to their overall rating from 2022 and see how it changed. We can also compare their salary and see how that changed. So to do that, we can use this button right here called Transform Data, which is actually one of the most powerful features of Power BI, and it's kind of hidden. So let's click on this, let's hit Transform Data, and this opens the Power Query Editor, which is an incredibly powerful way to transform and change our data sets. So let me go ahead and I'm gonna go ahead and duplicate FIFA 22, and what I'll call this is FIFA Merged. So this just creates a new data set, and what I'll hit is Merge Queries. All right, so what this is gonna do is it'll take FIFA Merged, which at the moment is really just FIFA 22, and it'll merge it with FIFA 2021. And you can choose which kind of join you want. So if you're familiar with SQL, these are the exact same joins as SQL. Basically, you can choose to take all the rows from one data set that match rows in another data set, which would be an inner join. So it's only rows that match between the data sets. You can choose to take all rows from both, or you can choose to take all rows from one data set and only matching rows from the other data set. In this case, I'm going to choose an inner join just because it makes some things simpler in our subsequent analysis. But you could try a different type of join and see how many players didn't play in 2022 who did play in 2021 and vice versa. All right, so we're choosing to do an inner join, and then we're going to have to choose which columns we want to join on. So in this case, we're going to join on this FIFA ID, which is just a unique ID for each player. All right, we're not going to use fuzzy matching because we're going to match on the exact ID. So I just unchecked use fuzzy matching. And I'm going to go ahead and actually, before I do that, this then tells you how many matches there are in each table. So there's about 13,300 rows in common. If we did a different type of join, it would look different. But I'm going to go ahead and hit OK and let this merge happen. And while this merge is happening, one really nice thing about Power Query Editor is it shows you every single step that you've applied to transform the data. And you can actually click on each and view the settings and change the step if you want to. You can also reorder, delete steps, etc. So it's really, really nice because if you make a mistake and you've done 10 other things after you made the mistake, you can actually go back and undo that and everything will rerun and it'll look good. And I'll show you some examples of this later. But yeah, this steps piece is very, very powerful. All right, so our data has been merged. There's now this column called FIFA 21. What we can do now is click here and select the exact columns we want to pull over. So I don't want to pull over all of the columns in the merge. I'll pull over overall. I'll pull over the wage, the value, and the potential, because those are the columns we can look at the differences between 2021 and 2022. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and pull those over. So I'll hit OK. You can see a new step has been added here called expanded, which is us expanding our merged rows. And we now have these 4 columns which contain the data from FIFA 2021. And we can compare that to our data from 2022. All right, so what we can do now is go ahead and create some new columns. So you can do that with this Add Column button. It is really handy how Power BI has all of the functions that we want. So what I'm gonna do is hit Custom Column. And what we're gonna do is we're gonna subtract our overall rating in 2022, and then we're gonna take our overall rating from 2022, and we're gonna subtract the rating from 2021. So this Power Query Editor, you can learn more about the query formulas if you click here, but it has its own formula language. It's different from the Excel formula language, and you can write your formulas using that language. So in this case, I'm just going to do a very, very straightforward formula. I'm going to say take the overall rating from 2022 and then subtract the overall rating from 2021. So that's what this minus is. And then I can hit OK, and this formula will go ahead and run. Okay, and then I noticed I made a small mistake in the column name. It's called custom. I don't want it to be named custom. There are a few ways I could solve this. So I could actually right-click on the column and hit rename, or I could go to steps and actually redo the merge that just happened. So I'm actually going to edit this step. So I hit that settings icon. We're going to call this column, it's called rating change. So let's go ahead and run that. Okay, so that's our rating change column. Actually, let's change it again. Let's call this overall change, because it's not, there's two ratings. There's potential and there's overall, and we want to be clear about which rating was actually changed. So let's call this overall change. We can add another column too, which is going to be the wage change. So this will be the wage EUR, which is the salary for the player in euros. And then we're going to subtract the 2021 wage EUR. So we're just subtracting those two columns, and we're creating a new column. Now this time, I didn't change the name, but I'll rename it using the right-click method. So let's go ahead and, that's Power BI is very powerful, but there's also a lot you can do, and sometimes it's easy to click on the wrong thing. So what we'll rename this is wage EUR change. All right, so what we just did is we merged our FIFA 2021 and our FIFA 2022 data sets. We then pulled out 4 columns that we wanted to look at in more depth, and then we subtracted our overall rating from our 2021 overall rating from the 2022 overall rating, and we did the same thing for wage. And you can see all of these steps here. So first, we merge the queries, and if you click on a specific step, it takes you back to that step. So we merged the queries, then we pulled out the extra columns, then we added a column, then we added another column, and then we renamed the column. So what you could do is you could remove one of these steps and just do that if you made a mistake, or you can go back and edit any of these steps. All right, but for now, let's go ahead and close the query editor, and we'll apply our changes, which means that we will go ahead and ask Power BI to run the results of what we just did in the query editor and create this new FIFA merged data set. So you can see we now have 3 data sets on the right. We have FIFA 21, FIFA 22, and FIFA merged. Okay, so the next thing we can do is we can go ahead and look at these differences. So let's go ahead and create another matrix. Actually, we'll just create a regular table. And what we'll do here is we will again look at the short name of the player. So we'll take short name, and then we'll look at the rating change and the other change. So let's go ahead and look at overall change, and let's go ahead and look at the wage EUR change. All right, and we can sort this so we can see which players changed the most. So we can see which players lost or gained the most ratings. This sort is a little bit weird, and the reason why is our column is the wrong data type. So let's go back and fix that. So if we scroll all the way to the end, these are the 2 columns we just added. We can click on them, and we can see this is a text column. So we're going to go ahead and change it to a whole number. This tells Power BI that this column is actually a number. And we can change this too to a whole number. All right, now this reveals another issue in what we just did. So if we go back to FIFA 21 overall, that's stored as a whole number. Wage EUR is also stored as a whole number. So we didn't check the data types before we went ahead and did the subtraction, but you should always make sure when you're subtracting or adding or creating a new column or doing any manipulation to a column that it's stored in the data type that you expect. In this case it was, but that's not always the case, and checking data types will save you from some potential mistakes. All right, so let's go back to our report, and the very cool thing is we didn't have to do anything. Since we changed our data types, Power BI automatically picked that up and populated this table correctly. So that's one very powerful thing about Power BI is you can go back and make changes to your data, and your report will change also. You don't have to redo your visualizations or your tables. All right, so here we can see players by their overall rating change. So we can see this player gained 17 points on their rating. We can also see how many lost overall rating. So you can see that here. We can also look at wage changes. So who lost wages, who gained wages, etc. Another interesting thing we can do is we can look at how, okay, that actually changed the existing table. I want to insert a new bar chart. And what we can do here is look at if the two are correlated. So if you lost rating, does that also correlate with you losing salary? Now, this does not imply causation, right? Because FIFA ratings are set independently from salaries. It may be that FIFA, the people who make the FIFA ratings look at salaries and say, okay, this player has a lower salary now, so maybe we'll rate them lower. It doesn't imply causation, but we can look at if there's a correlation between FIFA rating and salary. So let's go ahead and look at the wage EUR change in values. And then on the axis, we'll look at the overall change. So we can average this out. All right, so we can see that there does appear to be some correlation between losing rating and losing salary. You can see that in cases where rating went down, salary also seems to have gone down and vice versa. So that is an interesting analysis. We can also look at the more general case. We can just look at overall rating versus overall salary and see how those two line up. So let's go ahead and do that and look at average. So we can see, yes, these do seem very correlated and they're on an exponential curve. So the better you get, the exponentially more you earn. At least not causal, but there is a correlation here. So that's very interesting. So it looks like when you lose rating, so when a player potentially gets worse, they may potentially lose salary as well. Those two are correlated, and players who are better get exponentially more salary than other players. Those two are pretty interesting analyses. Okay, so what we just did here is we merged our two data sets and we looked at the differences between overall rating and wage from the 2021 through the 2022 season. Okay, the next thing we can do is we can look at this by position. So we can see which positions have the highest overall rating and the highest overall wage. So let me make a new report sheet here and call this position, because we'll look at players by their position. One complication here, which you may have noticed in our tour through the data, is player positions. Some players have multiple positions listed. And in this case, we only want a single position per row. Because if we are going to find the overall rating and the wage by position, this makes that very obscured, right? Because some players have multiple positions and it makes it hard to know for a particular position what's the overall rating. So what we'll do is we'll go back to transforming our data and we'll go back to our FIFA 2022 data set, and I'll duplicate this, and I'm going to call this FIFA 22 positions. All right, and what we'll do is we'll select our player positions column, and there is this really interesting option in Power BI if you go over to the Transform tab, and this option is called Split Column. And in this case, we're going to split the column by delimiter. So our delimiter is a comma, because there's a comma in between each potential position a player could play. And what we're going to say is split into rows. So basically, for this first row, Lionel Messi plays RW, ST, and CF, 3 positions. That's going to create 3 separate rows, one for each position he plays. And all the other data in the rows will be the same. And that way, when we look and say what is the overall rating for all right wingers, we'll include Lionel Messi. And if we look at ST or CF, we'll also include him. All right, so I'll do this and hopefully it'll be a little bit more clear after it runs, but let's go ahead and hit OK. So you can see we now have 3 rows, one for each position that Lionel Messi plays. All right, the next thing we want to do is we just want to do a little bit of trimming because there's white space in these rows, and we want to just trim out the trailing white space. So by doing trim, if there was RW space, that would just turn into RW. So that's what we just ran. And then other than that, this data set looks good. What we can now do is we could make a matrix table, a pivot table, and we could find overall rating for right wingers now, because there's now no commas or multiple positions in this cell. All right, so let's go ahead and apply these changes and wait for this to run. All right, and what we'll now do is create a matrix visualization. And in our rows, we're gonna have the player position from our positions dataset. So let's pull over player positions. And then our values will be overall, so overall rating, as well as wage. All right, so we can now see, okay, so what we have to do is overall should be the average and wage should be the average as well. So we can now see which position has players with the highest overall rating and which position has players who get paid the most. And it seems like both are pretty similar. All right, so what we just did is we just split up our player positions column and created separate rows for each position that a player can play. And then we went ahead and created this matrix visualization to find the average overall rating for each position, the average overall wage for each position. So this tells us the average person who plays left wing has this overall rating and this overall wage. All right, RBI lets you do a lot of stuff with just a couple of clicks. Okay, so the next thing we're gonna do is we're gonna build a map. And what this map will do is it'll show us by country how many players from that country are in our FIFA data. And this is really cool because Power BI does a lot of automatic stuff behind the scenes. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna pull over this nationality name column and put it in location. And in this case, nationality name is just the country you're from. And Power BI automatically matches it to the country and creates a map. Now, this map isn't particularly interesting. It shows us all the countries where football players in our FIFA dataset come from. But we can make it a little bit more interesting by adding a fill. And what this fill will do is it'll shade a country based on how many football players come from that country. So we'll have a gradient fill. It'll be filled based on the count. And let's go ahead and run that. And now you can see the darker countries are the ones that more football players come from. Let me make this bigger so you can see it. And you can zoom in and out, and we can see which countries have more players. Now, it doesn't tell you the number, but we can fix that. So what we can do is we can go to tooltips, we can add nationality name and count. So now if you hover over a country, it'll tell you how many players in our FIFA dataset come from that country. So there you have it, the countries with the most football players in our FIFA dataset. And I'll just call this countries. All right, so we've done a lot of analysis here. Let's do one more, and then we'll talk about next steps. So the next one is a fun one. So let's say we want to build a national team for each country, and we want the highest rated player at each position to play on that national team. So what we're going to do is we are going to find the highest rated player at each position for each country. Now, I know sometimes you have different schemes and you might have multiple players from a single position, etc., but we're not going to worry too much about that right now. We're just going to find the top rated player from each position for each country, and then we'll use that to find the average overall rating of each country's national team. So we're going to need to do some complex stuff to do this. So let's call this overall by country. All right, so the first thing we're going to do is we're going to go to our Power Query editor. And this time what we're going to do is instead of pulling out all of the positions that a player plays, we're only going to pull out the first position that a player plays. So we're going to go ahead and copy this and rename it to first position. All right, and then we'll go ahead and we'll split on player position again. This is because we want each player to only be on the national team once for one position. We don't want them to be, they can't play multiple positions at the same time for the national team. So we'll go ahead and split by delimiter. And what we'll say is we only want to split at the leftmost occurrence. And we'll say we want to split into columns. So let's go ahead and do this. All right, so now we have two columns. So one is the actual primary player position, so the first position that's listed for them. And the second is any secondary positions. So we'll go ahead and rename this column. Let's call this position. All right, and I'll go ahead and do the same thing I did before and go ahead and trim this column. So we just remove any extra spaces. All right, so we now have a data set where each player has just their primary, I think the first one is their primary position. but each player only has one position now. Okay, now the second thing we need to do is ensure we only have the top player at each position for each country. So in order to do that, we can run a Python script. If you're not familiar with Python, don't worry too much about this. We'll just run a really short script. But this is a very cool feature of Power BI. You can use Python and R to transform your data in cases where doing it in Power BI would require many more steps. And in this case, doing this in Python is faster than doing it in R. All right. So in order to do this, you have to have Python installed and you have to have it configured in your Power BI options. I'm not going to show you how to do that, but that just so you're aware. You also have to have pandas and matplotlib installed. And then what happens is Power BI will load your table, your data set, into this data set variable. And this data set variable will be a pandas data frame. So any changes you make, you want to assign back to the dataset variable. And in this case, what we'll do is we'll say dataset.groupBy, and we'll group by the nationality name, which is just the country that the player is from, and we will group by player position. So this is essentially finding for each country, for each position, it's finding all of the players in that group. And then we're just going to take the top player for each of those groups. And we'll do that by applying. And we'll do a lambda function. And what we'll do is in each group, we'll sort by overall rating. Sort values. All right. And what we'll do is we'll just grab the first row. If you're not familiar with Python syntax, don't worry too much about this. This you can do in Power BI. It just takes a lot longer in Power BI, so that's why I'm doing it in Python. All right, so this code will essentially find the top player at each position for each country. So let me just make sure I got all my parentheses closed properly. I think I did, so I'll hit OK. And then what happens is it's going to go ahead and run the script to transform the data. And it gives us the results this way. And then what we have to do is click here to pull out the columns we want from that script execution. So I'm just going to hit OK, pull out all of the columns. Oh, actually, what I did not want to do there was use a prefix. So I'll just get rid of that. All right, so what we should have now is just the top players for each country at each position. And we can verify if this ran properly in the next step. So I'll go ahead and just run everything. Okay, so now I can go to the data view, and I can go to this FIFA 2022 first position, and I can see there's 1,338 rows here. So that's a lot fewer rows than the regular data. And it looks like everything worked properly. So we can see, actually, you know what I should have done here? I'll go back and make some changes to this table. And what I'll do is, instead of trying to hunt through every single column, I'll only take the columns that we want. All right, so let me get rid of most of the columns. We'll take ID, we'll take the player's short name and long name, we'll take their position, we'll take overall, we'll take their wage, potential, and then what we'll also take is their nationality. So we'll take their nationality name, and that's really all we need. So I'll go ahead and run that, and that'll just make it a little bit easier to scan through this data and make sure we did things properly. So I'll go ahead and apply, and it'll just take a little bit to execute all of those steps, but that should be done shortly. Okay, all rows are loaded. So you notice here there's a lot fewer columns because we selected fewer columns in the Power Query interface. And then what we can do here is just sort, and we can make sure we only selected the top players at each position for each country. Now the problem we run into is some countries don't have players who play every single position, and that's okay, but that is a data issue to be aware of here. But other than that, it looks like our analysis ran properly. And now we can go ahead and create a report. So we'll again just pull in a map, and we will use our new FIFA 22 first position. We'll take nationality name as the location. And then what we'll do is we'll fill based on overall. Specifically, okay, this looks like it's the wrong data type. Looks like overall is the wrong data type. Yes, it's text. So we'll go ahead and change that to a number. Okay, so now what we can do is we can fill based on the overall rating. And we'll take the average. Okay, and then our tooltip will again be the average of overall. Okay, so here what we can see is the average rating of the top players at each position for each country, which could tell you how good the national team is. There's a lot of other things that go into how good the national team is. But this is one potential way to look at it. So we now have a map that shows us that. All right, so that is it for this Power BI tutorial. I'm going to talk a little bit about next steps. So you could do a lot more with this data if you want to. So you could analyze some of the other columns in the data. So if we go back to our FIFA 22 dataset, there are a lot of columns here you could look at. You could look at things by club, by league level, by club position, and a lot of other things. You could look at some of these other statistics. You could also look at data from 2015 through 2022. Remember, the original data had more sheets that we just didn't choose to import, but you could see how different players have changed in rating from 2015 through 2022. You could also look at other things that have changed from 2015 to 2022. Have the way ratings are distributed, has that changed? Have different clubs folded or risen or anything else? So there's a lot more you could do with this data. I hope you will do so, and if you do, please share your results in the comments section. We'd love to see any further analysis that you end up doing. All right, well, thank you very much. I hope this Power BI tutorial was helpful, and good luck with next steps.